Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Kobe. I'm an investigator here in the Center for Journalology at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. Today is the fourth session of our 2021 speaker series. I want to thank you all for your time. Really excited for the session today. We have two fantastic speakers lined up, and we're going to be talking about advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion in research, which is certainly very topical in our group, and I think many groups around the world. So just to start off by saying, if you're not familiar with the Center for Journalology, our group is directed by Dr. David Mower, and we're interested in a range of topics, including reproducibility, open science, open access, researcher assessment, and aspects of reporting quality. You can learn more about our group on our website if you're keen to do so. So as I mentioned, today we have two really fantastic speakers lined up. We have Dr. Cassandra Gould van Praag and Leslie Chan, and each will be speaking and bringing their own expertise with regards to equity, diversity, and inclusion in research. So how the session will work is we're going to start off with Cassandra speaking, and then Leslie will speak, and then there'll be about hopefully 15 or 20 minutes at the end where we can take questions from the audience. So if as the session is progressing, you have a question or a comment, please don't hesitate and put that in the Q&A function, and we'll get to those at the end. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Cassandra Gould van Praag. So Cassandra is the Open Science Community Engagement Coordinator in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Oxford. Her main focus is to create opportunities for the research community to actively participate and contribute to the open science infrastructure at Oxford. One key project is the WIN Open Neuroimaging project that she provides support with. Today, she'll be speaking about why good open science practices must be inclusive and what we can do to support inclusive open science practices. Her PhD is in informatics from the University of Sussex, and we're really pleased to have her here with us today, and I'll pass it over to you, Cassandra, to share your expertise with the listeners.
That's great. Thank you, Kelly, so much for that lovely introduction. Can I just confirm that you can see my slides?
Yeah, looks good.
And the transitions look good. I'm going to start my timer so I don't run over. So thank you so much for this invitation to speak today. This is such an important topic that many groups are becoming increasingly aware of now. So I'm very pleased for the opportunity to spread my position on it, which although I'm not someone who works in EDI or was trained in EDI by trade, it's something that touches all of us in all our different disciplines. So I think it's important to share perspectives inside our own disciplines. So as Kelly said, I'm going to be speaking to you about why I think good open science must be inclusive. And this is kind of coming from my position of being someone who advocates for open science. So I think open science is a good thing, and then we can make it even better by making it the most inclusive practice that we can. So the motivation for this talk came together when a colleague said that they are pro open science or open scholarship, and they were pro inclusivity, but they weren't sure whether one necessarily implies the other. And this was quite a surprise for me to hear that, because I think they are so closely interlinked. But if others aren't aware of the link, then I'm going to do my best to explain why I do think they should be thought of in the same breath. So by necessity, open science doesn't have to incorporate inclusivity, but I think improving the robustness of our research means that we should be paying attention to inclusivity. More importantly, though, than just improving the robustness of our research, there's a moral argument about why we should be increasingly thinking about inclusivity, and that relates to the justice of the science that we do and who can participate in our research. So there's both a rational or a sort of logical argument about why we should be thinking about inclusivity, but there's also a moral or justice orientated argument, and I'll be talking through both of those today. So first up, some terminology. There are the terms like diversity, equity, inclusion, inclusivity are used very widely and sometimes interchangeably, but they don't mean exactly the same thing. So to differentiate between the terms, I'm going to use a metaphor of a dance party. This isn't my metaphor, and I can give you the link for the originator, but it's a nice way of understanding the differences. So if we think about having a party, you first up have a guest list. So your diversity is who is invited to the party, who is on your guest list. So not just further than inviting people to your party, you have to actually include them in your party. And that, for example, could be considered of asking people to dance. Now you can ask someone to dance, but do they really feel like you want them to dance? Now that stage further is about inclusivity, and that's creating an environment where the people that you've invited and asked to be included actually feel like their experience and participation is welcomed. So in our party metaphor, inclusivity is the host playing music that everyone likes, and more importantly, other people there value the fact that the music is being played to make a welcoming environment for everyone. Now, open science is something that comes with many different definitions. One that I like is that open science is an umbrella term that involves various movements to remove the barriers from sharing of scientific resources at all stages of research. Now, it's this idea of barriers to sharing that I think speaks to the issue of inclusivity. So I'd like to think, what are the barriers to sharing scientific resources or accessing shared resources? Now, these barriers can be physical things like hardware or software. Maybe you don't have the infrastructure to distribute your data or your code. They can be limitations or barriers around time that you have to do the open science work, but they can also be more structural things like the incentives around doing open science and sharing your work, and also training in order to do the sharing work. And these barriers can be the result of a lack of resources at your institution, but more often than not, they are the result of historical privilege or exclusion. So those institutions which have received a lot of privilege often come with additional resources, whereas some institutions which are patronized by people without privilege are often under-resourced. So well, I believe that the important part here is that sharing enables other people to reproduce, extend, and verify your research findings. And this speaks to the reproducibility around open science. How can we expect someone to reproduce our work if they can't access it? But poor inclusivity can limit the number of people who can access your work. So the more people who are included or have access to your research outputs, the more opportunities we have for robust replication and extension. So this speaks to the rational argument about open science. So incorporating inclusivity can improve the robustness of your research by increasing the number of people and the broad range of people who can contribute to your validation of your research or extension. So to take that a bit further, we're talking here about robustness of research, and the idea here is that the broader the range of people who can contribute to your research, the more robust the product. And here we expect that diverse perspectives can make it possible to approach a research question from multiple different points of view. And this is called your positionality. So when you conduct some research, the hope is that we are these completely objective scientists with no emotional activity brought into our research, but we are humans and we all come from our own expertise and experience. So we'll bring that expertise and experience upon the question that we answer and how we address it. So if we can include lots of different people with a diverse perspective and backgrounds, we might be able to increase the objectivity of our research by virtue of looking at the question through multiple different lenses. And importantly, inclusivity here means that we want to create an inclusive environment which empowers everyone to share their experience and viewpoints in addressing the research question. And this includes at the publication stage. So one thing to consider here is that the lingua franca of scientific research is in English. So what kind of people are we promoting? What kind of environments are we promoting research to be shared in which the language of conferences and publications is mostly in English? What are we implying about people who don't speak English as a first language, and particularly the experiences of people who have to go through when people go through publication reviews, and the feedback that they get is about their English not being up to standard. So the kind of crux of this idea of rational argument around inclusivity is various bits of research that have demonstrated that diverse teams lead to better outcomes. And there's a number of different studies around this, but I'm just going to highlight one here because it comes with some nice graphics. And here this was a decision-making experiment done by an online decision-making platform. Now, in this study, business leaders were asked to put a decision out there or a question onto the platform, and the question was addressed by multiple different cohorts of people. And after the decision had been made or the question had been sufficiently answered, the person who originally posed the question judged whether the answer that was given was better than their expected outcome or met their expectations. And what was found was that the more diverse the teams that contributed to the decision-making process, the better the outcome was rated by the person who originally posed the decision. So one thing that was noted and is prevalent in this research is that increasing the diversity of teams can increase the friction around decision-making process or the sort of team dynamics. Now, this is just a part of the fact that if you have a very unmixed team, then everyone is speaking the same language and everyone comes with the same kind of ideals about the work that's done. And if you have a more diverse team, you have to have more consideration around a variety of topics, and that can slow down the speed at which conversations and ideas can develop. But this increase in friction was outweighed by the increased value of the decision-making process. So it can be harder to work in more diverse teams, but the value that is added by the diversity outweighs that increased friction or the increased complications. A problem, though, with this this system or this idea of like instrumentalizing diversity or doing diversity or increasing inclusivity makes us do better science is that we start to think about diversity as a commodity, and more importantly than the diversity as the commodity are the individuals that we're talking about when we're talking about increasing diversity and inclusivity. So I'd like to share with you a short series of three tweets from Dr. Pearl Agyakwa, who I think outlined this issue around consideration of diversity as a commodity. So I'm just going to read these out for you because I think she explains it really well. We talk about diversity in terms of its advantages as something that should be accommodated in order to enrich or add value to our research. Many respected and much loved colleagues in equality, diversity, and inclusion do bang on about this a lot. And while it is true that there is tremendous beauty and value in diversity, please stop and consider how dehumanizing this is, as it treats individuals and fellow humans as value-adding accessories to an otherwise satisfactory status quo. Our discourse should be focused on the fact that exclusionary cultures and practices need to be stopped simply because they are wrong, unjust, and harmful, even if there were no extra benefits to be derived from doing so. We must do better. So this speaks to the moral argument of inclusivity and the fact that incorporating inclusivity is something that we should be doing to improve the justice of our practice of science, which, as we know, is highly biased and is not a perfectly functioning machine. So we should be doing what we can to address the issues around justice in our work. So I'd like everyone to briefly reflect on an idea, a feeling, or a time when they felt particularly excluded. So when have you felt excluded or unwelcomed in a group, and how did that affect you, your work, or your motivation? Now, this could be at a work event, it could be at a conference. I mean, we don't really go to conferences anymore, but that feeling of approaching a situation where you want to contribute to the conversation, but you're made to feel unwelcome. And that a lot of research in this field has shown that, that there are physical and emotional effects of exclusion are incredibly detrimental to the individual. So being poor inclusivity first is something that we can consider exclusion to be. And exclusion has been found to lower commitment and engagement. it increases health problems, it increases job and educational performance anxiety, and it increases stereotype threat behaviours, reduces career aspirations and repressivity to feedback. Now, as a group leader or just as a person, it's kind of scary to think that our own behaviours can be affecting individuals in the ways described here about increasing health problems, but then also at a systematic level, the business of science that we're a part of and the systematic exclusion that we are contributing to has been documented to increase the negative behavior, the negative experiences of many people in our industry. And this sort of is aligned with the idea of dominance hierarchies. So across many different characteristics of race, age, gender, there are hierarchies of who is considered to be dominant or what characteristics are dominant. And these dominant characteristics, these people are more powerful, they are more often included, and their needs are prioritized. And then on the other side of that, that spectrum, there are the powerless people in these hierarchies, and the powerless people are typically excluded and their needs are ignored. And this is, as I said, across a number of different characteristics of ethnicity, gender, age, sexuality, and this is the idea of intersectionality. So any one person can classify themselves in across these different dimensions and in multiple ways. And in any situation, any given context, we may be more or less powerful based on which of these characteristics is dominant in that any one situation. And this idea of dominance and whose needs are included and whose voice is prioritized is something that I think is potentially has caused a lot of problems around who sets our research questions and who sets the research agenda. Now, the image on screen I've got here is of the lead characters in an English TV program called Doctor Who, which I'm not sure if that makes it across the entire world, but in the TV program Doctor Who, the Doctor is an alien Time Lord, and with every new series or every couple of series of the TV program, the Doctor is reincarnated with a different body. They're the same person, but they have a different body. And throughout the history of this program, which started in the, I think, 60s or 70s, the Doctor has always reincarnated as a white man. And in the last two recent series, the Doctor has been a woman, and then in the most recent series, she's a black woman. So this is just my sort of comic, slightly tongue-in-cheek take on the history of science and who has been designating the issues that we're addressing in science historically, who has been leading that agenda. And how does the perspective of these people influence the research questions that are important? How does this influence how the research is designed and who can contribute to the research? And I'm hopeful that going forward, we are coming to increasingly value the diversity of the people who set the research agenda, as well as the people that contribute to the research. So lastly, I'm going to close on some tips about how I think things that individually we can do to build more inclusive environments. So one that is a particular stickler for me is around gender neutral address. And I know this is interpreted differently in a UK context as opposed to in North America. But when I hear people address a room as guys, hey guys, that for me signals gender. You're addressing the men in the room. So I watched a TV program called it was Love Island or something, and they speak to everyone. They say, all right guys, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, and then they separated the guys and the girls. So although they talk about guys, we're talking to everyone, they're implicitly talking only to the men and addressing only the men in the room. So now every time I hear guys, hey guys, it gets my back up. So you might want to consider using a more gender neutral term like folks or y'all, which is something that doesn't work in my accent, but hey y'all, I think is a really lovely way of making sure that when you're speaking to a crowd, you're actually speaking to everyone. You can also make a point of specifying your pronouns, and the idea of this is to normalize the idea that we shouldn't assume people's gender or make people guess the gender of the person they're speaking to. So you can do this in your Zoom profiles. I think you can't do this on Teams because Teams is set up by your institution, and my institution hasn't made space for me to specify my pronouns, but you can put it in your email signature and other places. So you may not think that it's difficult for people to guess your gender, but this is, as I said, it's about normalizing removing the assumption. So it may be easy for people to guess your gender, but it may not be so straightforward for other people, and other people can experience some really negative sort of psychological effects if people's gender is assumed incorrectly. You can also promote inclusive event design and consider people's caring needs and disability. So this is something that happens a lot in or happens to a certain extent in in-person conferences, but now as we move into online conferences, there's a whole different section of considerations that we should be having around who can access the material. So before we gave this talk, I checked with Kelly whether subtitles were available, and they are. And I also make a point of trying to be quite descriptive of the material that's on my slides, where the where a visual interpretation of what is on screen is important to understanding the message that I'm trying to convey. But then there's also things around timings of events and how long you're expecting people to sit at their desk. So we've just currently got a paper under review with GigaScience, I think, which talks about promoting inclusive event design for online events. And there's a lot of things coming out recently about this. So it's a really important consideration, and something that this move to online events means that we've got a great opportunity to make a lot of change around who we include and who can participate in our events. Another really great way that you can build inclusive environments is to create opportunities for diverse role models. So I've got a caveat with this about overburdening an already under-resourced group. So if you've got someone who you find is always speaking on this issue of diversity, and perhaps they are disabled or they are a person of colour, then be mindful of the fact that they, as a scientist, potentially are also doing their other work, and their other work is the thing they get paid for, and that they are already experiencing a significant disadvantage in doing that other work because of their diversity characteristics. So it's great to create opportunities, get the diverse people involved in presentations, for example, but be mindful of the fact that these people are already working harder in other ways, and don't go speaking to the same person each time, or perhaps even better, you can ask them to make suggestions of other people that we might like to invite into these conversations. One great tip is to educate yourself on the importance of privilege and impact of privilege, and think about the experiences of others. So this is diversifying your Twitter profile, your Twitter timeline, reading books by diverse authors, watching films by people who are different to yourself in some way, and just opening your range of life experience to people who are different to yourself, and understanding more about how those differences impact the lives of others. And finally, it's important to become cognizant of the voices that aren't in the room. So in these meetings and in others around diversity or any kind of topic, look around you and think about the ways that everyone is very similar or very different to each other, and think about what we are missing by those voices not being invited and participating in the conversations we have, and seek out ways to listen to those people. So finally, to wrap up, to bring you back to the original motivation of this talk, someone says they're pro-open scholarship and pro-inclusivity. That's great, but they're not sure whether one necessarily implies the other. I think that important to remember here is that your work is not reproducible if it can only be accessed by people who are like you. Exclusion causes suffering. This is well documented. And are you contributing to that? And also remember that your practice is positional. What developments are being missed and what opportunities are missed in the science that we're doing, and the opportunities to understand the world by some voices being excluded from our practice of science. Oh, wrong way on the slides. That's it. So a few short thank yous here to some people who have been really influential in my journey along this ideas of open science and inclusivity, and a quick punt for 2 programs that I've been a part of, the Open Life Sciences program and the CSCCE, Centre for Scientific Collaboration and Community Engagement, where I've been really privileged to have some fantastic conversations around these issues. So tons and tons of information there that I whipped through really quickly, and I'm very happy to take as many questions on as many different issues at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. That was really incredible. You're a fantastic speaker, and I really like the use of examples to illustrate the points, and the examples of how to build an inclusive environment at the end in particular. So thank you again, and as Cassandra mentioned, please feel free to add comments or questions into the chat, and we will get to them at the end of the session. So I'll move on now. I'm sure folks have lots of thoughts for Cassandra, but we'll, without further ado, introduce Leslie Chan. So Leslie is an associate professor in the Department of Arts, Culture and Media, and the Centre for Critical Development Studies at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, where he's also the associate director. He's been active in the experimentation and implementation of scholarly communication initiatives of varying scales globally for quite some time. Today, he's actually going to be speaking about his personal reflections on a fairly recently released Canadian document from the Canadian Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences Advisory Committee on Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Decolonization. It's a final report and recommendations on how to engage with these difficult and necessary issues from both an individual and institutional perspective. One thing I wanted to share further about Leslie that I learned recently was that he was actually one of the original 16 signatories of the Budapest Open Access Initiative. So that stemmed from a meeting in Budapest in 2001, and I think is really a historical and defining document in terms of open access and its history globally. So I'll pass it over to Leslie now to give his talk. Thank you again, Leslie, for your time and for your willingness to share your expertise.
Thank you, Kelly. And thank you, Cassandra, for your presentation. And I think my segue very nicely into yours, and thanks for laying out all these important concepts and frameworks and recommendations, because I think my talk follow fairly nicely with some specific examples. I also like to think that many of the issues you raise are very, very important, but they also address some of the what I would call more visible challenges or barriers that people face in terms of participation in science and open science in particular. So some of my examples will deal with some of the what I call less visible, or in fact invisible, barriers that are deeply embedded in institutional history and their structures. And I think that if we want to really understand structural challenges and how to make real lasting structural changes, we do have to unpack some of these invisible changes, because they're taken as norm often. And so how we can challenge some of these norms in our institution, make them visible in the first place, is really the main point of my discussion. So I do have some slides to share. Let me see if I can get it to work. Can you see my slides now? Or?
Yep.
And I understand if I go to full presentation mode, I will actually lose the whole screen.
You'll just see your slides then.
Yeah, I think I can just keep it in this particular mode or something. Sure. Yeah.
Sure.
Or maybe not. It doesn't let me actually. Okay, so let me get started on this. So when Kelly, again, thank you for inviting me into this conversation, Kelly. When you invited me to speak here at the time, the Federation for Humanities and Social Sciences just released their report on what they call equity, diversity, and inclusion and decolonization. It was intended for members of the Federation. There are many scholarly societies that are part of the under the umbrella of the Federation, and part of what motivated the formation of this advisory committee that wrote this report was that in 2019, when the Federation held their annual Congress, which bring together all these scholarly societies from across the country, there was an incident where a Black student was accused of theft of a computer. And it was after investigation, of course, it was not the case, but the fact that the student's Blackness was really much the reason why the student was implicated in the first place, makes the Congress realize that there's a lot of biases in our system, and that academic institutions and scholarly societies are not immune from these kind of biases. Anti-Blackness, anti-indigenous oppressions are systemic problems within our institutions for a long time, and they rear their ugly heads from time to time. And in order for us to have systemic changes, we really need to get at the root cause of some of these issues. And this committee, in addition to the more standard EDI kind of terminology, they added, they feel that it's important to add decolonization to be part of the understanding of how to think about systemic change. And decolonization means also many things, but in the report they have particularly provided this, what I think a very useful framing of how to think about decolonization as a necessary and ongoing process of unlearning, uncovering, and transforming legacies of colonialisms, as well as utilizing the educational and knowledge systems available to relearn and to rebuild the social and cultural linguistic foundations that were lost or eroded through colonialisms. Some would even say that were systematically erased through colonialism. So colonial decolonization requires making space, balancing, generating, and enabling diverse knowledge systems to thrive in the academy, as well as in and through educational and knowledge transmitting places for indigenous peoples, the formerly colonized, or the continuing colonized nations, people, and cultural knowledge systems. And of course, oppressions of people by another group of people is an ongoing challenge everywhere still today. And I think the first step towards thinking about equity, diversity initiative in any institution, again, is to understand and acknowledge, number one, that they exist. If you refuse to acknowledge that they exist, and many people still refuse to acknowledge their existence, there is really very hard to move forward in terms of systemic change. Now I'd like to quickly situate where I'm coming from. I work at the University of Toronto, as Kelly mentioned, and I constantly struggle with these kind of contradictions within my institutions. I love where I work is one of the most diverse places on earth at University of Toronto, Scarborough, where I teach. I walk into a classroom of 200 students, and I could practically name a country in the world, and I'll find a student coming from that part of the world. And if I name a language, I probably have a good chance of finding a student in the room who speaks one of those languages or multiple languages fluently. So we have a very diverse classroom, a diverse institution with people from all over the world coming to learn and study together. So that part of it is fantastic. But on the other hand, we still have a set of institutional norms that only favor a certain kind of criteria of success. what constitutes excellence and what constitutes success in this framework. And the University of Toronto, like many universities, are very much addicted to this notion of rankings. And Cassandra earlier talked about the problem with these hierarchies, right? The hierarchies create dominance. It creates the sense of superiority and inferiority and better and worse, that kind of comparison. And so the question I ask myself is, do we really need this kind of comparison? Why does this kind of criteria persist in our institution? Yet at the same time, our institution have, in principle, adopted many criteria that are very, very commendable in terms of diversity initiatives. I found recently that our university hired the first person, Black scientist, who is going to be in charge of our EDI initiative in research at the university. So these are all very encouraging development. So the contradiction I grapple with is why do we have these very different set of ideals? One that understand diversity inclusion as being important, and the other one actually prioritize exclusionary criteria, right, ranking as a kind of institutional badge. So how do we square these contradictions? Now, I was particularly intrigued when Kelly invited me, and I looked up the Center for Journalology. I don't know if I pronounced this correctly, and I'm interested to see that journalology is the science of publication practices and the study of these activities, which is great. I think we need to study more how publishing is practiced and so forth. But I also would like to argue we need to understand the history of the publication practices as well. So I would suggest journalology should include history of publishing in its definition. Now, last year, after the murder of George Floyd, which, by the way, is now 1 year anniversary, yes, as of yesterday, there was widespread reckoning that systemic racism, particularly anti-Black racisms across institutions, are rampant, not only in policing and the military, but in our esteemed institution like the academy. And what was interesting was at the time, Nature, one of the most well-known journal in the world, arguably, came out with these statements that they recognize themselves as a white institution that is responsible for bias in research and scholarship. And Nature said that they were committed to working to end anti-Black practices in research. I was very pleased to see that statement. And that they wrote a very extensive editorial about why they need to do better and how Nature itself is really steeped in a kind of whiteness that perpetuate biases in science and scientific publication. Great admission. Now, if you look at the history of the journal Nature, and it has a long history, one of the oldest journal, and it goes back to 1869. What is not so surprising is that you look at all the editor-in-chief, and there were only 8 of them, and well, there are 9 now, actually. They were all male, and they're all white, and they all took long tenure, each of them, some almost 20 years. And so these are establishment. These are the establishment of science that define how science is done, and the standard of science are created by these by the journal, the institution, and these editor-in-chief, and of course their support infrastructures. Now, I said until recently there has been no other no female editor-in-chief, but this has changed recently. But the point is that is very recent in time. There's a book, a history book by Professor Melinda Baldwin on the journal itself, the long history of the journal. And there's a really intriguing statement in there by one of the editors that wrote about the nature of the journal itself, and that he reminds us that, well, journals are not simply passive vessels for recording what research has been done. They're not. They actually set agenda. They define, and powerful organizations or institutions like Nature actually define how science is recognized and what constitutes good science, and even what it means to be a scientist. So over this long history of the journal, the norms of science and the practice of science and the excellence of that definition of excellence and all that are all embedded in these journals. They define how science are evaluated as well, not simply recording what has been researched. And so when you have an institution that is so steep in Eurocentric whiteness, it is not surprising that institutions continue to render other way of knowing and other group of people invisible. And many prominent Black scientists and scholars can tell you that this is still very much a systemic problem across institutions. And we have Professor Bompas here talk about her experience as a Black scholar scientist, that often her problems when she raised them, they are not seen until another white faculty member validate them, and then they become real. And so racism is very much present in our institution. And again, as I kept saying, that that we need to acknowledge before we can move forward. And Francis Henry and Carol Taylor, two of the long-time scholars in equity, diversity, and higher education, have these statements about what whiteness means. And they reminded us that whiteness are really social constructs that are created by human beings, and they become these kind of institutional truths and norms, and they are universally accepted. And so these kind of norm has a way of reinforcing institutional practices, privilege, and cultural behavior, and white culture norms and values, and all these areas become naturalized for those who work in the institution. And I have to confess, I mean, as a international student that came to this country in the 70s, I was very much socialized into the norm of whiteness. I didn't question the norm at all. I didn't know my university, other than being ranked #1 and have a long history, is also the largest landowner in the city of Toronto. And the land ownership often imply a lot of very questionable practices of possessing land that used to belong to the indigenous people that lived on them. And it happened that the university campus on which I work was the ancestral land of the Mississauga of the Credit River for a long time, and before that it was the Huron, Wendat, and the Seneca. And these were the indigenous people that were erased from the land and from our institutional memory. And it is important that we recognize how our institution benefit from this kind of erasure. Now, Henry and Taylor also reminded us that whiteness then, became the framework or the lenses through which we see the world and how the world is defined. Now, I've taken the liberty of taking the word whiteness, and I substituted the word whiteness with science, and the statement reads equally familiar. So in this case, science is considered to be the universal and allow ones to think and speak as if science describe and define the world. So I would like to argue that science is very much often is defined through this very narrow set of lenses, and we need to take off those lenses as decolonization really means, and to think about how we think about other ways of knowing and other knowledge system that could actually enrich our way of understanding the world, which is increasingly complex and complicated. And so finally, to conclude, what is inclusion? And again, I want to take the statement from the EDID report, and that inclusion foregrounds the social and institutional relations of power and privilege, and drawing necessary attention to those who get a seat and voice at the decision-making tables, and who is empowered by institutional process, policies, systems, and structures. And so it is very, very much about institutional structures and how powers are preserved. And so if we want to do anything to change these structures, we need to understand where they come from and how to systemically disrupt and dismantle them. So hopefully there's time for some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Again, a really fantastic talk. We were really treated today by the two of you in sharing these expertise and experiences. I think, Leslie, your talk was fantastic, and the examples you gave to illustrate the sort of historic biases in institutions and in the publishing system are really fantastic. And unfortunately, we don't have to go too far or look too hard to find them, because they're the norm, not the exception. So we do have some questions, and I hope others will share more now in the Q&A. So I'll begin with a question that came in from an attendee, and maybe I'll first put it to Cass, because I think it was during her talk it came in. It says, excellent talk and very important for our research. Can you speak to the value of gender neutral versus gender inclusive language? There is a concern that gender neutral terms may just enforce the norms of hetero, cis, white, etc. classification.
Muted. I would absolutely agree around we should be considering gender inclusivity rather than just gender neutral. So this, an example that I experienced was in around preparing information for people going on parental leave, and I was tasked with redrafting a document that has been written years ago, and it was talking about mothers going on parental leave and breastfeeding and all these very gendered words, and around the idea of that a family is hetero and cis, and we had to work really hard to uncover what are the appropriate gender inclusive terms and speak to the people who are trying to move the conversation in terms of gender inclusive language rather than away from just gender neutral language. So that takes active work to seek out the terms that individual communities would prefer us to use. And I think that's an evolving situation as well. It's not something you need to keep on top of, like what's the appropriate terminology to use around, for example, parenting or race or any other kind of characteristic. So yeah, absolutely, we should be looking to be more inclusive rather than just assuming that a binary or a neutral is appropriate.
Great, thank you so much, Cass. So the next question here comes from Michelle Mullen, and maybe I'll direct it to you, Leslie, first. Then the question is, do you have strategies for increasing inclusion of invisible diverse characteristics?
Yeah, so if you agree my argument that, you know, there are certain norms that are embedded, you know, into how we think about scholarships, those norms are restricting the way we're seeing what are other scholarships that are possible. And so you really need to be able to put on other lenses or multiple lenses to allow you to see beyond what you've been trained to see. And I think those of us who are sort of very much disciplinary focused and work in certain way of publishing become very fixed in seeing how we learn, how we see different forms of knowledge. So I think the strategy is really to say, well, you know, maybe there are different ways to think about research methods, think about participation, Think about result sharings. Think about hypothesis formations. How about working with communities in ways that that expand your understanding of what their needs are and so forth. So shifting perspective and really allowing yourself to see beyond how you are formally trained, right? So unlearn, as that diversity report reminded us, is unlearning what we've been trained to see. And it's not easy, and it takes a lot of stepping outside and engage in conversation like this to make it happen.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Leslie. And I think, as you say, sort of this unlearning is quite hard. And one thing that I wondered about, if maybe each of you could address, is what is the role of training or education, both formal and informal, in this space? And in that regard, you know, as someone trying to learn more about how to embed these practices as an individual and as part of a research group, are there resources or leaders or groups that are leading in this space that we should be considering? Maybe I'll go back to Leslie and then I'll go to Cass afterwards.
Yeah, so again, you know, for those who are in graduate school, we know that, you know, graduate training is very conservative. It's about replicating the status quo. You're being cloned by your supervisors and your discipline to be more of the same. So you don't challenge the norms often. And so, so one of the things that I keep reminding graduate students is that, you know, there are a lot of other options out there. You don't have to publish only in these journals that are so-called high impact journals. There are lots of other community of scholars and practitioners who are publishing and sharing knowledge in very novel, creative ways. Become part of those community and you know, become expand your network beyond what you're being trained to become. So there are lots of possibility out there, and expanding those kind of networks is a good first step.
Great. Thanks so much, Leslie. Cass, do you have anything to add to that response?
So when we talk about EDI at our institution, it's the immediate response is, what training can we purchase in order to address this issue? How can we educate people? And we look at things like bias and implicit bias training, and let's send people on a course, and then all of a sudden they'll become really receptive to this idea that they have bias. But I think I agree in part with what Leslie was saying about expanding your own network and having an awareness of the structures that are in place. I think that, so there's a lot of research that comes out around these issues, but that research is very much speaking to the people who are already in the majority. You know, the research is produced in order to convince the white majority that there are issues in this area. And part of me, I think, when I talk about this as a rational argument, is because we are scientists, potentially, and we want to see evidence, and we want to see numerical, quantitative benefit from these things. But the more powerful argument, hopefully, is around this moral issue. So the more you immerse yourself in different experiences of people, the more you become accepting of the idea that your position and your experience isn't universal. The more, I think, effective you can be in sort of tackling these issues on an individual level, but then also in contributing to the systematic changes as well. So yeah, training exists, but really it's about, I think, what you can open yourself up to as an individual, and challenging those norms, as Leslie said.
That's great. Thanks so much, Cass. There's a question that came in from Evangeline, and I think it sort of touches on some of the similar themes that we just addressed, but one further point is she's wanting to know about how we can encourage institutions to look beyond awareness and into action. So more concrete steps that they can take. Maybe I'll go back to you, Cass, and then I'll go to Leslie after.
So this is again another one that sort of gets my back up. The sort of comparator at the moment is it's Mental Health Awareness Week, or has been recently, and everyone's issuing these statements around, oh, we value the mental health of our researchers and we value diversity, but what are you actually doing to improve this situation and address the issues? And in terms of mental health, it's like, oh, here's a seminar on how to meditate. It's like, no. Let's actually look at the issues around workload, for example, that are causing mental ill health. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer to this. I think that I'm starting to have more conversations with people that are actually working in EDI in my institution, and I think they come across the same frustrations. It's very easy to issue a statement and also to arrange some programs of activities, but whether these are actually affecting the structural issues. And I think the problem is that, as Leslie so illustrated, that the structural issues are so deeply embedded in everything, not only our institutions, but in our own behaviours, that I think the important consideration here is to take responsibility for your own actions and what direct action you can make, and how you can contribute to normalizing more inclusive behaviours, but be cognizant of the systematic issues as well, and be a part of improving the conversation around action and not just words and committees.
Great. I see you shaking your head. Yes, Leslie, do you have anything to add to Cass's great
No, I
feedback?
just want to amplify what Cass is saying. It is action has to begin with oneself. I think I'm always reluctant to listen to so-called experts on certain topics when they haven't really done anything to change their own personal practices themselves, right? And so, yeah, it has to begin with oneself, questioning one's own practices. How am I complicit to perpetuating that inequity within our system? Am I calling things out when I see them? Or am I just letting it happen, right? And I have to confess, for many years, I have no idea how to address. I see things and I say, oh, okay, that happened, and that's not acceptable. I have to call myself out now, and obviously, you want to make it such a way to allow your colleagues to also comfortable taking action without really putting them in an uncomfortable situation. But you do need to call things out when you see them. But starting with oneself, right? I mean, simple things like, I don't do peer review for certain publishers because what they perpetuate. So it's very simple practice, right? And I only publish things in certain venue to support what I believe in terms of inclusion and equity, and so you can do this kind of thing very directly yourself, right? And for me, it's about also interacting with students, creating spaces for my students so that they can experience the kind of diversity of knowledge systems that I talked about. So I don't just teach the classics to them, right? And I want them to explore. I allow them to teach me what they bring from their own culture and their prior learning and their background, and I think that's enriching for everybody as well.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for your thoughts. There's still 3 or 4 questions that have come in, and unfortunately we won't have time today to address them during the live Q&A, but maybe we'll pop in some responses via text after. I just want to thank both Leslie and Cassandra for their time, and I think both your institutions are very lucky to have you to share your expertise and to act as leaders in this space. And we really appreciate your time today, helping our community to grow in this area as well. So with that, we'll end the session for today. Folks who have attended, thank you also for your time. We'll send along a YouTube link afterwards, so folks can rewatch the session or share it with peers in their network. So for now, thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you, Kelly. Nice to meet you, Cassandra.
You too, thank you.
Bye.